The gentle aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of casual conversations in the bustling café. The morning sun cast a golden glow through the large glass windows, creating an illusion of warmth despite the biting chill outside. The small shop was alive with the clatter of dishes, the rustling of newspapers, and the occasional burst of laughter from the well-dressed customers enjoying their breakfast. It was an ordinary day, until the door creaked open and an uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Through the entrance stepped Thomas Gibbons, an 89-year-old man, his frail frame shuffling forward with slow, careful steps. His clothes, worn thin and patched in places, barely shielded him from the cold. His shoes, once sturdy, were now scuffed and tattered, revealing the tips of his socks through holes in the leather. The deep lines etched into his face told a story of hardship, of years spent battling not just time, but life itself. He moved with the hesitance of a man who knew he was unwelcome before he had even spoken a word. As he crossed the threshold, the usual café chatter faded, replaced by a disapproving hush. Eyes flicked toward him, some filled with mild curiosity, others with blatant disdain. He could hear the faint whispers behind cupped hands, the subtle shifting of bodies as customers leaned away, as if his mere presence was an intrusion into their comfortable world. Thomas swallowed hard, ignoring the sting of judgment. He had been through worse. He had survived war, outlived friends, buried loved ones, and spent the last decade watching the world move on without him. He had learned that dignity was a fragile thing, easily shattered in moments like these. But today, his hunger outweighed his pride. With trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket, his calloused hands fumbling over a handful of coins. They were all he had left, the final remnants of his pension check that had long run dry. He approached the counter with cautious hope, standing before Marcella Barnes, the cafe owner, a woman whose sharp eyes held no patience for charity. "Good morning, ma'am," Thomas said, his voice hoarse, weathered by years of hardship. Could I have a sandwich? Just the cheapest one you have, please." He carefully placed the small coins onto the counter, arranging them with the precision of a man who knew their worth too well. They clinked softly against the polished wood, a sound that seemed deafening in the heavy silence of the cafe. Marcella, a woman known for her unyielding rules and cold demeanor, arched an unimpressed brow. She looked down at the scattered coins, then back at Thomas, her lips curling into a smirk. "This isn't a soup kitchen, old man," she scoffed, loud enough for the entire cafe to hear. "We don't do handouts." A few chuckles rippled through the room. A businessman in a tailored suit shook his head, amused. A woman in a designer coat took a slow sip of her latte, pretending not to watch, yet clearly entertained by the spectacle of humiliation unfolding before her. Thomas stiffened, his hands twitching at his sides. A deep, familiar shame clawed at his insides, threatening to steal his breath. I have money," he stammered, nudging the coins forward. Marcella scoffed, crossing her arms. "That's barely enough for a slice of bread. If you can't afford to eat here, I suggest you leave." The words hit him like a slap. He had expected reluctance, perhaps even mild annoyance, but this was cruelty dressed as authority. His chest tightened, his stomach twisting painfully. Why was it always like this? Why did people assume poverty meant worthlessness? His hunger and dignity warred within him. If he begged, they would laugh. If he stayed silent, he would starve. A voice rang out from the back of the cafe, dripping with mockery. "You heard the lady, old man. Take a hint." A younger customer, his hair neatly combed, smirked as he tapped his credit card against the counter, flaunting the wealth Thomas had long lost. Laughter followed, hushed but unmistakable. Thomas felt his body betray him, his legs growing weak, his hands trembling more violently than before. His heart pounded with the weight of disgrace. And for the first time in a long while, he wished he were invisible. The cafe had become a courtroom, and he was the defendant on trial for the crime of being poor. Tears burned behind his tired eyes, but he willed them away. He would not cry, not here, not in front of them. His lips parted, but no words came out. And then, just as he was about to turn and leave, to escape the cruel eyes and whispered judgments, the cafe door opened once more. A gust of cold air swept through the room, and with it, a presence that demanded attention. A woman stepped inside, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor. The cafe fell silent as she moved forward, her presence effortlessly commanding the space. Isabella Davenport. She was a woman of power, of influence, and everyone knew it. Owner of the city's most prestigious luxury boutiques. A business tycoon whose name carried weight. She was elegant, poised, dressed in a tailored coat that likely cost more than the cafe's monthly rent. But today, it wasn't her status that held the room captive. It was the look on her face, sharp, disapproving, and utterly unreadable. Her gaze locked onto Thomas, then flicked toward Marcella with a slow, assessing glance. What exactly is going on here? Isabella's voice was calm, yet laced with authority. Marcella straightened, suddenly less confident in her stance. This man, she began. But Isabella cut her off with a single lifted brow. I heard everything. Marcella swallowed. The customers watched in uncomfortable silence. Isabella turned to Thomas, her expression softening just slightly. How much is a sandwich here? She asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. Marcella hesitated, her voice quieter now. $8. Without breaking eye contact, Isabella pulled a crisp $100 bill from her wallet and placed it onto the counter. This should cover his meal, she said, and everyone else's. The cafe erupted into shocked whispers. Marcella's face paled, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Thomas looked at Isabella, his throat tight with emotion. I don't know how to thank you, he murmured, his voice breaking. She gave him a small, knowing smile. Don't thank me yet, she said, her eyes drifting toward his wrist. And then, she froze. Her breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Because there, on Thomas's frail wrist, peeking out from beneath the worn cuff of his tattered jacket, was a watch she had seen before. A watch she knew. A watch that made her blood run cold. Her eyes darted to his face again, this time with a new kind of urgency. Sir, she whispered, voice suddenly unsteady. Where did you get that watch? Thomas blinked, confused. He glanced at his wrist, then back at her. It was a gift, he said slowly, as if pulling the words from the depths of a memory long buried. From my son, Emmanuel. And just like that, Isabella's world came crashing down. What would you do in Isabella's place? Leave a comment below. Like this story if you believe in standing up for kindness. Subscribe for more emotional and powerful stories. The cafe, once filled with the soothing aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries, had become a battleground of silent judgments and stifled laughter. The chill in the air was no longer just from the cold morning breeze slipping through the door. It was the coldness of humanity. The frigid indifference that wrapped itself around Thomas Gibbons like a heavy chain. The 89-year-old man, frail and exhausted, stood at the counter, his trembling hands hovering over the few coins he had placed down, the remnants of what little he had left. His fingers, calloused from decades of labor, brushed against the coins as if touching them could somehow make them multiply. But it was futile. His request was simple, a sandwich. Just the cheapest one, anything to ease the gnawing hunger clawing at his stomach. But Marcella, the cafe's owner, had no patience for the likes of him. This isn't a soup kitchen. She had spat, her lips curling in disgust. Laughter had followed, soft chuckles from well-fed customers. Their designer coats wrapped tightly around their privileged frames. Their warm hands curling around cups of overpriced lattes as they watched the spectacle of a starving old man being humiliated. Thomas's chest tightened. He had survived wars, loss, and the unforgiving march of time, but somehow, this moment, in this cafe, surrounded by strangers, was breaking him in ways he had never known possible. He had wanted to fight back, to demand respect, to remind them that once upon a time, he was strong, that once, he had held his newborn son in his arms and dreamed of a life where love and honor meant something. But time had stripped him of everything. And so, he swallowed his pride. Please, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, but thick with desperation. The cafe remained silent, save for the low murmurs of whispered mockery. And then, the door opened. A gust of wind swept through the cafe, fluttering napkins and sending a chill down spines. But it wasn't the wind that caused the shift in the room. It was her, Isabella Davenport. She moved with a grace that commanded attention without asking for it. Her coat, cinched at the waist, was an unmistakable mark of affluence, the kind of wealth that turned heads. But today, it was not her wealth that silenced the café. It was the fire in her eyes. Her gaze swept across the room, taking in the scene before her. She had walked in expecting the usual morning bustle. But instead, she found a scene of quiet cruelty. An old man, frail and trembling, being ridiculed over a meal he could barely afford. And she felt it, a pang deep in her chest. Fury, disgust, but also, something else. Something unexplainable. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached the counter. "What's the problem here?" Isabella's voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, like a blade hidden beneath velvet. Marcella stiffened, attempting to mask her sudden discomfort with arrogance. "This man doesn't have enough money," she said, as if it were an explanation rather than an excuse. Isabella turned to Thomas. His eyes, worn and tired, met hers, and for the first time that morning, there was no judgment in the gaze he met. No pity, just understanding. She reached into her purse and pulled out a crisp $100 bill. Placing it on the counter with a deliberate motion. "This should cover his meal," she said. Then, she added, louder this time, "and everyone else's." A murmur rippled through the café. People shifted in their seats, suddenly uneasy under the weight of their own silence. Marcella's face drained of color. She started, but Isabella wasn't finished. "You have the right to run your business however you see fit," Isabella said, her voice calm but piercing. "But tell me, Marcella, when did cruelty become part of your customer service?" Silence. Thomas looked at the bill, his hands still shaking. I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. She smiled, but there was something in her expression, something unreadable. "Don't thank me yet." And then, her eyes dropped to his wrist. Her breath hitched. Time seemed to freeze as she stared at the watch barely visible beneath the sleeve of his worn-out coat. A watch she knew. A watch she had given away, a lifetime ago. A lump formed in her throat as she took a hesitant step closer. "Sir," she said, her voice now shaky, "where did you get that watch?" Thomas blinked, confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor. He looked down at his wrist, then back at her. "It was a gift," he said slowly, his voice heavy with something distant. Something lost. She swallowed. "A gift? From who?" His hands clenched slightly, and then, his next words shattered her world. "From my son," Thomas said, his voice trembling. "Emmanuel." The air was suddenly thick, pressing against Isabella's chest, making it hard to breathe. "Emmanuel." Her fingers twitched at her sides. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone in the café could hear it. The memories hit her like a wave, dragging her under. She had loved him. Oh, how she had loved him. The letters they wrote, the promises whispered under moonlight, the dreams they painted of a future together. And then, he was gone. Just like that, torn away. She had spent years trying to move on, convincing herself that the pain would dull. That time would make it easier. It never did. And now, standing in front of her, in the form of a frail old man, was the only connection she had left to him. A father, who had lost his son just as she had. Her eyes burned. She felt herself shaking, but she couldn't move. Marcella, sensing something was unfolding that was far beyond her comprehension, stepped back quietly, as did the other customers. The laughter had long since faded. No one dared speak. No one dared to break the moment. "Emmanuel," Isabella whispered, the name barely escaping her lips. He was my. She couldn't say it. She didn't need to. Thomas's eyes widened, realization dawning slowly but painfully. "You," he murmured, studying her face now, looking at her as if seeing a ghost. She nodded, unable to find the words. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, two people bound by a shared grief, standing in the middle of a café that no longer existed to them. Thomas's wrinkled hand clenched the fabric of his coat, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was thick with unspoken sorrow. "He loved you." Isabella felt something inside her shatter into pieces. And then, for the first time in years, she let the tears fall. She didn't care who saw. She didn't care about the café, or Marcella, or the strangers who had once laughed at his pain. Because right now, none of that mattered. Right now, it was just them, a grieving father, and a woman who had never stopped loving his son. And suddenly, she knew, this was only the beginning. Thomas sat on the edge of his bed, the silence of the small apartment pressing in on him like a heavy weight. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall and the howling wind outside. It had been hours since he had returned from the café, since his entire world had been upended. Meeting Isabella had unearthed memories he had spent years trying to bury beneath survival. The pain of losing his son, Emmanuel, had never truly left him. It had simply settled deep within him, a constant ache that never quite dulled. But tonight, that ache had sharpened into something unbearable. His son had loved this woman, and she had loved him. But Thomas had never known. Now, after years of loneliness, poverty, and regret, he realized he had unknowingly passed by the one person who could have helped him carry the weight of his loss. He turned to the small wooden nightstand beside his bed. A single photograph sat there, the edges yellowed with time. It was the only picture he had left of Emmanuel. In it, his son stood tall, laughing, his arm around a woman whose face had long since been cut out of the frame, a decision made by Victoria, his late wife. During the worst of her grief, Thomas sighed deeply. He traced the edge of the torn photograph with a trembling finger. How could he have let life become this? How could he have let himself fade into nothingness? Reduced to a man who had to beg for a sandwich in a cafe filled with people who wished he didn't exist. His chest tightened. For years, he had believed Victoria's words, that Emmanuel had left them because of the woman he had loved. That she had taken him away, distanced him from his family. Thomas had blamed her, without ever knowing her name, without ever hearing her side of the story. And yet, today, that very woman had been the first person in years to show him kindness. How cruel life could be. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window. And Thomas realized something. He couldn't stay here any longer. This place, these walls, they were suffocating him. He had been merely existing for too long, stuck in this tiny, dimly lit room where his past haunted him. But tonight was different. Something had shifted. He reached for a small, tattered bag from under the bed. The same bag he had carried with him the day he lost everything. As he packed, a quiet sadness settled over him. He had so little: a few worn clothes, an old comb, a faded letter from Emmanuel, the last one he had ever written. And the watch. His hands lingered on it. The one thing his son had left behind. Now, he knew it meant something far greater than he had ever realized. With slow, deliberate movements, he slipped the watch onto his wrist, fastening it securely. It was time. The city streets were cold and unforgiving, the air biting at his fragile skin as he walked. The small amount of money Isabella had given him was still tucked inside his coat pocket. But he refused to use it yet. It was too precious, a kindness given with no expectation of repayment. He would rather walk than spend even a dime of it. The streets were silent, save for the distant sounds of honking cars and the occasional siren wailing in the night. The city didn't care about men like him, men who had been forgotten, discarded, left to wither under flickering streetlights. Thomas had spent years living this way, wandering, searching for a place where he could simply exist without being sneered at, without being told to leave. But there was nowhere. He passed by restaurants where families laughed over steaming plates of food, their worlds warm and full, while he was left shivering outside, watching from the other side of the glass. He walked past storefronts, the bright lights making his ragged reflection look even worse, a cruel reminder of what he had become. And then, he saw it, a small public park. He had slept here before, on nights when he had no place to go, when even the shelters were too full. The benches were worn from years of use, but they were better than the icy pavement. With exhausted limbs, he made his way to a familiar bench near the fountain. He lowered himself onto the hard wooden surface, letting out a breath that felt heavier than it should have been. As he sat there, his thoughts drifted to Isabella. Would she come looking for him? Did she even care? He had no answers, but for the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him, a longing to be remembered, to matter. The morning sun had barely begun to rise when Thomas stirred from his restless sleep. The night had been cold, and he could feel the stiffness in his joints as he tried to move. Then, he heard a soft voice. "Sir, excuse me?" His eyes flickered open. Standing before him was a young woman in a café uniform, holding a small brown bag and a cup of steaming coffee. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to approach. "I saw you sitting here last night," she said gently, glancing at his thin frame. I brought you something to eat." Thomas's throat tightened. It had been so long since a stranger had offered him something without cruelty. Without expectation, he looked down at the bag and then back at the young woman, searching for the mockery he had grown so used to seeing. But there was none. With shaking hands, he took the bag. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. She smiled, then quickly turned to leave, as if afraid she had overstepped. But before she disappeared down the street, she called back over her shoulder, "There's a café a few blocks from here, they open early. You can sit inside if you need to warm up." And just like that, she was gone. Thomas sat there for a long time, staring at the simple meal in his hands. A sandwich, a cup of coffee, the same things he had begged for just yesterday. And yet, this time, it had been given freely. A warmth spread through his chest, not from the coffee, but from something deeper. Maybe, just maybe, not all people were cruel. As the city stirred awake, Thomas found himself gripping the watch on his wrist. Isabella. He had to find her. He had to talk to her. For the first time in years, he had hope. He had spent so much time running, hiding, barely surviving. But what if he could finally stop running? What if he could face the past? What if he could finally matter again? Taking a deep breath, he rose from the bench, his bones aching but his spirit just a little bit lighter. The city awaited, and for the first time in a very long time, Thomas was ready to see where it led. What would you do if you were Thomas? Let us know in the comments. Like this story if you believe everyone deserves a second chance. Subscribe for more emotional stories that will touch your heart. The city streets were alive with movement. But for Thomas, every step felt like walking through a ghost town. The world around him continued, vibrant and full, while he existed in the shadows, a forgotten man among thousands who didn't spare him a second glance. He had nothing, no home, no family, no place to belong. The cold wind cut through his thin coat as he shuffled down the sidewalk. Clutching his bag tightly, the little money Isabella had given him was still tucked in his pocket. But he refused to spend it on himself, not yet. Not when there was still one last thing left to do. He had to find Victoria. For years, she had been his only companion in this life of hardship. They had fallen together, two broken souls left to fend for themselves when the world abandoned them. She had lost more than just a home. She had lost hope. Thomas knew that if he didn't find her soon, he might lose her forever. His heart pounded with fear. Would she even recognize him anymore? Would she still want to hold on to life? Or had she finally let go? He quickened his pace. He couldn't let her slip away too. Thomas's footsteps echoed in the alleyways as he searched for the only person in this world who still knew his name. Victoria had been wandering for weeks, refusing to stay in one place for long. She didn't trust shelters, didn't trust people, and he couldn't blame her. The last time he had seen her, she had been so frail, so weak, her body trembling with hunger and exhaustion. He had promised to bring her something, anything to ease her suffering. But now, as he turned the corner into a familiar, abandoned lot, a feeling of dread settled deep in his gut. She should have been here. This was her usual place. Instead, there was nothing. No blanket, no makeshift shelter, no sign of Victoria. His breath caught in his throat. Had she left? Had something happened to her? Panic surged through him as he turned, scanning the streets. His voice was hoarse, weak, but he called out anyway. Victoria? Nothing. Just the wind. His chest tightened as he pushed forward, moving through the streets with a new kind of urgency. Every moment that passed felt like an eternity. Where was she? Then, in the distance, near a worn-out bus stop, hunched against the concrete wall, he saw her. His breath caught. She looked even worse than before. Her hair, once carefully kept, was matted and tangled. Her body so thin it seemed like the wind might carry her away. Her hands trembled as she clutched a tattered old coat around her shoulders, as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Thomas felt his chest ache with guilt. He had been too late. She had given up. He swallowed hard before approaching, his voice barely more than a whisper. Victoria, it's me. At first, she didn't react. Her eyes were unfocused, staring at the pavement like she wasn't really there. Victoria, please, look at me. Slowly, painfully. Her gaze lifted, her face froze. For a long moment, she just stared at him, as if trying to figure out whether he was real or just another memory slipping away. Then, In a voice so soft it almost didn't exist. She whispered, "Thomas?" His heart ached at the sound of her voice. She remembered him, but barely. He dropped down beside her, reaching out a trembling hand. She flinched at first, an instinctive reaction. But then her expression softened, and her lips trembled. "You came back," she said, her voice breaking. Thomas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. She let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "I thought you left," she whispered. "I thought I lost you, too." His heart broke at those words. How many nights had she sat here, alone in the cold, thinking she was truly abandoned? How many times had she told herself no one was coming back for her? He reached into his coat, pulling out the small bundle of food he had managed to find. "Eat," he said softly, offering her the bread and coffee. Her hands shook violently as she reached for it, her body so weak that even this small motion seemed like a battle. She took one bite of the bread, and tears slipped down her cheeks. He had never seen someone cry over something so simple. But this was not simple. This was survival. This was life itself. She chewed slowly, savoring every second, as if afraid the food might disappear if she ate too fast. And Thomas could only watch with guilt twisting in his stomach. Why had it taken him so long to come back for her? How could he have let this happen? As Victoria finished eating, her eyes flickered back to his. For the first time in years, there was something new in them. Something fragile. Something that looked a lot like hope. "Thomas," she said hesitantly, what happens now?" For the first time, he didn't have to think. "We're not doing this anymore," he said firmly. She blinked, confused. "This life," he continued, "the streets, the hunger, the cold, it ends tonight." She let out a shaky laugh, but it was filled with disbelief. "Thomas, we have nowhere to go." He took a deep breath. "Yes, we do." Her eyes narrowed slightly, trying to read the expression on his face. And then, realization dawned. "Isabella." She said the name like it was a dream. Like it was too good to be true. Thomas nodded. "Isabella," he confirmed. "She wants to help." For a long moment, Victoria didn't speak. Then, her voice cracked. "Why would she help us?" Thomas swallowed hard. "Because she's kind," he whispered. "Because she loved Emmanuel." Victoria flinched at the name. Even after all these years, it still hurt, but she didn't push it away. Instead, she took a slow breath, her lips pressing together. Then, finally, she nodded. "Okay, just one word." But to Thomas, it was everything. It was a chance to fight for something better, a chance to live. As the sun began to rise, Thomas helped Victoria to her feet. She was weak, but she stood, and together, they walked away from the life they had barely survived. They left behind the cold benches, the cruel stares, the endless hunger, and they walked toward hope, toward a second chance, toward Isabella, toward home. The city skyline blurred past the window as Isabella's car sped toward the hospital. Her hands clenched the steering wheel, her mind racing. The call she had received just moments ago still echoed in her ears, each word slicing through her like a blade. "Your father is in critical condition." The weight of those words pressed against her chest. She had spent years trying to move forward, to rebuild a life that wasn't haunted by the past. But now, just like that, the past had come rushing back, demanding to be faced. Thomas, her father, was fighting for his life, and she wasn't sure how to feel about it. Her heart twisted painfully as memories flashed in her mind. The last time she had seen him, he had been so frail, sitting on a park bench with Victoria, his only companion in a world that had long since turned its back on him. He had tried to act strong, tried to reassure her that he was fine, but Isabella had seen the truth in his eyes. He had been tired, worn down, and now, he might be gone before she could say everything she needed to. As she pulled into the hospital parking lot, Isabella barely put the car in park before rushing inside. The sterile smell of disinfectant filled the air, and the sound of distant beeping machines sent a chill down her spine. She approached the front desk, her voice shaking. "Thomas Ward," she said, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "Where is he?" The receptionist typed something into her computer before looking up with a sympathetic expression. "Room 317, she said softly, "but he's in critical care." The words hit Isabella like a punch to the stomach. She turned, her steps heavy, her heart pounding as she made her way through the long, white hallways. With every step, her thoughts spiraled deeper into what-ifs. What if she was too late? What if she never got to say goodbye? What if the last thing her father ever remembered was the way she had hesitated to bring him into her life? She reached room 317 and stopped outside the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. She wasn't ready, but there was no more time to wait. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The sight before her stole the air from her lungs. Thomas lay on the hospital bed, pale and motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Tubes and monitors surrounded him, the soft beeping of machines the only sign that life still clung to his body. Victoria sat beside him, her hands clasped together as she whispered prayers under her breath. When she saw Isabella, her tired eyes filled with relief and sadness. "You came," Victoria murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Isabella swallowed hard and stepped closer. "I had to." She looked down at her father, the man who had once been so strong, so unbreakable in her childhood memories. But now, he was just a man, frail and human, caught in a battle he might not win. The sight of him like this tore her apart. Victoria's voice broke the silence. "He's been asking for you." Isabella's breath hitched. He had been asking for her. Even when he was slipping away, even when his body was failing him, he had still wanted to see her. She reached out, hesitating for only a second before gently taking his hand. It was cold, too cold. "Dad?" she whispered. His eyelids fluttered, and then, slowly, he opened them. For a moment, Thomas just stared at her, as if he wasn't sure if she was real. Then, a weak smile touched his lips. "You came," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Tears stung Isabella's eyes. "Of course, I came." His fingers trembled as he squeezed her hand, his grip barely there, but still filled with something she had been searching for all her life. Love, regret, a silent plea for forgiveness. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." Isabella's throat tightened. She had spent so many years waiting to hear those words. But now that she had them, they felt too small, too fragile against the weight of everything they had been through. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she shook her head. "I don't care about the past anymore," she choked out. "I just want you to be okay." Thomas let out a weak chuckle, but it ended in a cough. "I don't think I get to decide that." The beeping of the machines suddenly felt too loud, too final. Isabella's grip on his hand tightened. "You do," she insisted. "You have to fight. You have to keep fighting." His eyes softened. "For you?" She nodded, sobbing now. "For me." The next few hours were a blur of doctors, nurses, and whispered conversations that Isabella barely registered. All she could do was sit beside her father, holding onto him like she could somehow anchor him to this world. Victoria never left his side, either. Neither of them spoke much. They just waited for a sign, waited for a miracle. And then, the machines beeped faster. Isabella's head snapped up as the doctors rushed in. Her father's body convulsed, his breath hitching as pain tore through him. "No, no, no," Isabella gasped, her heart shattering. She lunged forward, gripping his hand. "Stay with me, Dad, please." Thomas's eyes fluttered open one last time. And he smiled. "I love you, Isabella." Then, the machines went silent. A long, deafening tone filled the air. Isabella's world collapsed. The funeral was small, simple, quiet, just how Thomas would have wanted it. Victoria stood beside Isabella, her grief matching her own. And yet, there was peace in her eyes. As if, somehow, Thomas had finally found the rest he had been searching for. As they lowered the casket, Isabella placed a single letter on top of it. It was one she had written the night before. A letter she had never gotten to read aloud. A letter forgiving him. A letter saying she loved him. Because, in the end, love was all that mattered. As the last bit of earth covered his grave, Isabella took a deep breath. The past was finally at peace. And maybe, so was she. What would you have said to Thomas if you had one last moment with him? Let us know in the comments. Like this story if you believe in the power of forgiveness. Subscribe for more heart-touching stories that remind us of what truly matters. The hospital felt different today. Less sterile, less cold, but maybe that was just Isabella's heart tricking her. Desperate to find something comforting in a place filled with pain, she stood outside room 214. her hands clenched at her sides, her pulse hammering against her skin. Inside, just beyond this door, was a man she had spent years trying to forget. Her father, Thomas Ward, a man she had buried in her memories, convinced that was the only way to move forward. And yet, fate had other plans. When she had received the call about his illness, her first reaction had been to ignore it. After all, he had ignored her when she needed him most. But something deep inside her, wouldn't let her turn away. So, here she was, standing at the edge of a past she never thought she'd revisit. She lifted her hand, hovering over the door handle, her fingers trembling slightly. What was she supposed to say? Was she supposed to pretend everything was fine? Was she supposed to demand answers for the years of absence? Or was she just here to say goodbye? A lump formed in her throat at the last thought. No, she wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Taking a deep breath, she finally pushed the door open. The sight inside nearly brought her to her knees. Her father lay in the hospital bed, weaker than she had ever imagined. His once strong frame was now frail, his skin pale, his body swallowed by the white hospital sheets. His breathing was uneven, and for a moment, she thought he was asleep. Then, his eyes opened. And the second he saw her, everything froze. For a long time, they just stared at each other, caught between the weight of the past and the fragile hope of the present. "Isabella," he whispered, his voice hoarse and tired. Hearing her name from his lips felt foreign, like it belonged to another lifetime. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to step forward. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was softer than she expected, and that softness seemed to break him. Tears welled in his tired eyes as he tried to sit up. But his body was too weak. I didn't think you'd come," he admitted, his voice filled with something unrecognizable. Was it regret? Was it guilt? She didn't know. But she did know one thing. Seeing him like this hurt more than she had prepared for. She sat beside his bed, hesitating before resting her hands in her lap. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The years of distance and silence stretched between them like an invisible wall. And yet, here they were, in the same room, after so many years apart. Thomas took a deep breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." 2 words. Just 2 words. And yet, they carried so much weight. Isabella's heart clenched, her mind flashing back to the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wondering why her father never came back for her. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times. Imagined herself yelling at him, telling him about the years he had missed, about the pain he had caused. But now, sitting here, the anger wasn't as strong as she thought it would be. Instead, there was something else, something far heavier. Sadness. Because looking at him now, she realized something painful. He had suffered too. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice breaking. Her father closed his eyes, exhaling a shaky breath. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted. "After your mother died, I didn't know how to be a father anymore. I was a broken man. And I didn't want you to see me like that. So He stopped, his face twisting in pain. "So you left," Isabella finished, her eyes burning with unshed tears. He nodded, his jaw clenching. "I thought, maybe if I stayed away, you'd have a better life. That you wouldn't have to deal with a father who was drowning in grief." Her breath hitched. All these years, all this time, and the reason he had left wasn't because he didn't love her. It was because he thought he was doing the right thing. She turned away, blinking rapidly. "You could have just told me," she whispered. "You didn't have to disappear." Thomas sighed, his voice full of regret. "I know." And for the first time, he truly looked broken. The room felt heavier now. The truth had been spoken. And now, there was only one question left. Could she forgive him? She had spent so many years holding onto the pain, holding onto the anger. But now, looking at her father, weak, fragile, regretful, she realized something. The past could not be changed. But the future was still unwritten. Slowly, she reached for his hand. His eyes widened as she wrapped her fingers around his, her grip gentle but firm. "I don't know if I can forget," she admitted, her voice shaking. "But maybe I can forgive." A choked sob escaped him. And then, for the first time in her life, she saw her father cry. From that day forward, things began to change. She visited him every day, bringing him food, sitting beside him as he told her stories she had never heard before. Stories of her mother, Stories of his regrets. Stories of love, loss, and second chances. They laughed. They cried. And slowly, bit by bit, they began to heal. But even with all the love in the world, time was not kind. Thomas grew weaker. And then, one night, Isabella got the call she had been dreading. She rushed to the hospital. But when she arrived, she knew. She was too late. Her father was gone. The grief hit her like a storm, knocking the air from her lungs. But this time was different. Because this time, she knew the truth. She knew he had loved her. She knew he had never stopped thinking about her. And she knew, deep in her heart, that she had forgiven him in time. At his funeral, she placed a letter on his grave. A letter saying all the things she never got to say. A letter thanking him for trying. A letter letting him go. As the wind carried her whispered goodbye into the sky, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The pain would always be there. But so would the love. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The hospital walls had always felt cold to Isabella. But today, they didn't seem as daunting. Maybe it was because she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of her past all by herself. Her father, Thomas, was still weak, still battling the illness that had taken so much from him. But something in his eyes had changed. There was hope now. There was a quiet determination. And most of all, there was love. Thomas had always been a proud man. The kind of man who never asked for help. Who suffered in silence. But now, he wasn't alone anymore. Now, he had her. Isabella refused to leave his side. She brought him warm meals, read to him, and held his hand when the pain became too much. For the first time in his life, Thomas allowed himself to be vulnerable. He let his daughter see him as he was, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had lost so much, but also a man who wanted to make things right. Every day, she sat by his bed, listening as he spoke about the years he had wasted, about the regrets that haunted him. "I should have been there for you, Bella," he whispered one evening, his voice barely above a breath. "I should have fought for us." She swallowed hard, gripping his frail hand. "You're here now," she said softly. "That's what matters." A single tear rolled down his cheek. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could be forgiven. It wasn't just Isabella who had been affected by Thomas's absence. Her son, Leo, had grown up without a grandfather. And now, as a bright-eyed 10-year-old, he was finally getting the chance to know the man who had once been nothing more than a ghost of family stories. At first, Leo had been hesitant. After all, how do you open your heart to someone who was never there? But Thomas didn't give up. Despite his weakened state, he made an effort to be present. He asked Leo about school, about his favorite books, about the things that made him happy. And slowly, bit by bit, a bond began to form. One afternoon, as Isabella walked into the hospital room, she found Leo sitting on the bed beside his grandfather, flipping through an old photo album. Thomas was pointing at a faded picture of himself as a young man, standing next to Isabella's mother. She was beautiful, Leo said in awe. Thomas smiled, his fingers grazing the photograph. "She was," he whispered, "and she would have loved you, kiddo." Leo beamed, and Isabella felt her heart swell. For the first time in a long time, her family felt whole again. As the days passed, Thomas grew weaker. The illness was relentless, and deep down, Isabella knew time was running out. But her father, he refused to give up. "I need to make things right," he told her one night, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. She frowned, concern flickering in her eyes. "Dad, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I can't change the past, Bella, but I can change the time I have left." He looked at her, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. "A promise. A vow. I won't waste another second," he said. "Not with you. Not with Leo." Tears filled Isabella's eyes, and she nodded, believing him. And for the first time in her life, she saw the man she had always hoped he would become. Thomas spent every moment he could with Leo. They played card games in the hospital room. They watched old movies together, laughing at the silly jokes. And sometimes, when the pain became too much, Thomas simply held Leo's hand, grateful for the time he had left. One night, as Isabella was tucking Leo into bed, her son looked up at her with tears in his bright blue eyes. "Mom, He whispered. Is Grandpa going to get better? Isabella's heart clenched. She had spent her whole life wanting the truth from her father. Now, she had to give the truth to her son. I don't know, sweetheart, she said softly, but what I do know is that he loves you. And he's fighting to be here for you. Leo sniffled, nodding. I love him too, he admitted. Isabella kissed his forehead, her heart aching and full all at once. Because she knew that even if time wasn't on their side, Thomas had finally found what truly mattered. As weeks turned into months, Thomas continued to fight. His health wavered, but his spirit remained strong. And through it all, Isabella and Leo never left his side. One morning, as Isabella arrived at the hospital, she found Thomas sitting up in bed, staring out the window. The sun was rising, painting the sky with shades of gold and pink. When he turned to look at her, there was peace in his eyes. I finally understand, he said, his voice soft. She tilted her head, stepping closer. Understand what? He smiled, taking her hand in his. What it means to be a father, he whispered. Tears blurred her vision as she squeezed his hand tightly. And in that moment, she knew that no matter how much time they had left, her father had already redeemed himself. Because love wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up. And finally, he had. When Thomas took his last breath, Isabella was right there, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort, letting him know that he was not alone. Leo sat beside her, silent tears rolling down his cheeks. He kept his promise, the boy whispered. Isabella pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Yes, she said softly, he did. In that moment, she realized something beautiful. Her father may have missed the first half of her life, but in the time he had left, he had given her something even more precious. His love, his presence, and most of all, his redemption. Thomas had fought his way back into Isabella's life. He had made amends, had earned the love of his grandson, and had redeemed himself in the time he had left. But just when everything seemed to be falling into place, the past came back with a vengeance. Because there was one person who wasn't willing to let him go so easily. Eleanor had always been a woman of status. She had stood by Thomas for years. Through his rise in business, through his cold ambition, and even through his years of emotional neglect. She had built her life around his success. She had sacrificed everything for him. And now, she was losing him, not to another woman, but to something even worse. To his past, to Isabella, to the daughter he had once abandoned, but was now willing to give up everything for. Eleanor had been watching from the shadows, waiting for her moment. And now, as Thomas lay in a hospital bed, frail but finally at peace, she decided it was time. She stormed into the hospital, her heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. Her presence was like a storm brewing on the horizon. Fierce, unforgiving, determined to reclaim what she believed was hers. She walked straight to Thomas's room, her heart pounding, her mind racing. And when she pushed open the door, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Thomas was sitting up in bed, laughing. Beside him, Isabella was reading a book aloud, her voice gentle. Leo sat on the edge of the bed, his small hand gripping his grandfather's. The sight was so normal, so warm, so unlike the Thomas she had always known. For a moment, she hesitated, because this was not the man she had spent years with. The man she had loved had been ruthless, unyielding, focused only on power. But this man? He was soft. He was happy. And worst of all, he had chosen them over her. Eleanor refused to be ignored. She cleared her throat, making her presence known. Isabella turned first, her face instantly hardening. She knew who Eleanor was. She knew why she was here. Leo, sensing the tension, instinctively moved closer to Isabella, his little fingers clutching her sleeve. And then Thomas looked up. His smile faltered. His past and present had finally collided. Eleanor, he said, his voice filled with an emotion Isabella couldn't quite place. Thomas, Eleanor said, stepping forward. It's time to go. The room went silent. Isabella's breath hitched. Leo's grip tightened. And Thomas, for the first time, he didn't know what to say. Eleanor's eyes swept across the room, taking in the scene with barely concealed disdain. A hospital bed. Thomas, she sneered, this is where you want to end your days? Surrounded by, she glanced at Isabella, her lips curling. Strangers? Isabella's jaw clenched. We're not strangers, she said, her voice steady. We're his family. Eleanor let out a humorless laugh. Family? She repeated. Where was this family when he built everything he has? When I stood by his side. Helped him become the man he is? Isabella stared her down. The man you helped him become, she said slowly, isn't the man he wants to be anymore. Eleanor's eyes flashed with fury. But before she could speak, Thomas did something no one expected. He reached for Isabella's hand and held it, firmly, deliberately, and then, with a voice that was weaker than before, but filled with conviction, he looked at Eleanor and said the words that would change everything. I'm not going anywhere. Eleanor staggered back, as if the air had been punched from her lungs. For years, she had been the only one he listened to. For years, she had controlled his world. And now, he was choosing Isabella. Over her. Over his business. Over everything they had built together. Eleanor's fingers curled into fists. She was losing control. She had come here expecting to win. She had come here expecting the man she had always known. The man who would do whatever was necessary to keep his empire intact. But instead, she found a man who had changed. A man who had found peace in the very thing he once pushed away. Love, family, a second chance. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice shaking. Thomas let out a tired sigh. Yes, he whispered, it is. And with that, Eleanor turned on her heel and stormed out of the room. Gone. Forever. The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Isabella watched her father, searching his face for regret, for hesitation, for any sign that he might change his mind. But all she saw was relief. Leo's small voice broke the silence. Grandpa? Thomas turned, his eyes soft. Yes, kiddo? Leo hesitated, then whispered, you're really staying? Thomas smiled, his fingers brushing through Leo's hair. For as long as I can, he said, I promise. Leo grinned, and Isabella felt her heart shatter and heal all at once. For the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for her father to leave. Because this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Thomas had spent his whole life chasing power. And in the end, he had walked away from it all. Not for money, not for status, but for the one thing that truly mattered. Love. And as Isabella sat beside him, as Leo laughed and told stories, as the world outside kept moving, she knew one thing for certain. Her father had finally found what he had been searching for all along. And this time, he wasn't letting it go. Do you think Thomas made the right choice? Let us know in the comments. Like this story if you believe in the power of second chances. Subscribe for more heartwarming, emotional stories. Thomas had made his choice. He had chosen his daughter over his past, his grandson over his business, and love over power. But life has a way of testing those choices. And on one fateful night, Thomas would face the ultimate test, one that would decide whether he truly deserved the second chance he had been given. It started as a peaceful evening. Leo was drawing at the kitchen table, humming softly. Isabella was folding laundry, stealing glances at her son, grateful for how much happiness he had found in these past months. And Thomas, frail but content, was sitting on the couch, watching them with a soft smile. For the first time in decades, he felt at home, not in a mansion, not in a boardroom, but here, in this small, imperfect apartment, surrounded by the very people he had once abandoned. But peace is fragile, and it can shatter in an instant. It happened so fast. 1 second, Leo was laughing at something silly his grandpa said. The next, he was struggling to breathe. Isabella looked up just in time to see her son's small hands clutching his chest. His face turning pale. Her heart stopped. Leo? She called, rushing toward him. The little boy gasped for air, his eyes wide with panic. And then, he collapsed. Call 911, Isabella screamed, her voice breaking. Her hands trembled as she lifted Leo into her arms, feeling his tiny body convulse. Thomas, pale as a ghost, fumbled for his phone, his old hands shaking too much to dial. But they didn't have time to wait. Isabella scooped up her son and ran. Barefoot, with her heart pounding in her ears, she sprinted through the building, down the stairs, into the cold night air, screaming for help. And by some miracle, a neighbor saw her. Get in the car, the woman shouted. Isabella didn't hesitate. With tears streaming down her face, she climbed into the backseat, cradling her son, whispering prayers between sobs. Thomas followed, his breath ragged, his heart hammering in his chest. As the car raced through the city, sirens wailing in the distance, Thomas clutched Isabella's hand. He wanted to say something, to tell her it would be okay. But for the first time in his life, he was completely powerless, and nothing had ever terrified him more. The doors burst open as they arrived at the hospital. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Leo, pulling him from Isabella's arms. She tried to follow, but a nurse held her back. "Ma'am, you need to wait here." "No, please. He's my son," Isabella cried. "Let them work," Thomas whispered, gripping her shoulders. His voice was steady, but his hands shook uncontrollably. Together, they watched as Leo was wheeled away, disappearing behind cold, white doors. And then, the silence fell, a silence so loud, it felt like it could swallow them whole. Hours passed. Isabella sat, motionless, staring at the floor, her face pale and tear-streaked. Thomas sat beside her, but he wasn't okay. His chest felt tight, his breath was shallow. His old heart, already weakened, was straining under the weight of his fear. He had spent a lifetime chasing success. And yet, in this moment, he realized he had nothing if Leo didn't survive. He had failed his daughter once, had abandoned her when she needed him. And now, God help him, he couldn't lose her son too. Not now. Not after everything. Finally, the doors opened. A doctor emerged, his face unreadable. Isabella leapt to her feet. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Is he okay?" The doctor sighed. "He made it through the first critical stage," he said. But, that word hung in the air like a knife. "But what?" Thomas rasped, his voice barely more than a whisper. "There were complications," the doctor admitted. "Leo had a severe allergic reaction that triggered respiratory failure. We stabilized him, but his lungs..." He hesitated. "What?" Isabella demanded. The doctor's expression softened with sympathy. "Leo may need surgery. And, there's a chance he won't recover fully." Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Thomas staggered, his old hands clutching his chest. And suddenly, the air disappeared. "Dad?" Isabella turned just in time to see Thomas fall to his knees, his face twisting in pain, his vision blurred, his heartbeat thundered in his ears. And then, everything went black. The last thing he heard was Isabella screaming his name. When Thomas woke up, everything was bright and sterile. An oxygen mask was strapped to his face. Machines beeped around him. And when he turned his head, he saw Isabella sitting beside him, her eyes swollen from crying. For a moment, he didn't speak, didn't move, because the fear was too much. And then, with a trembling breath, he asked the only question that mattered. "Leo?" Isabella's lip trembled. She took his weak, wrinkled hand in hers. And then, she nodded. "He's stable," she whispered. "He's okay." Relief flooded Thomas's frail body, so intense that tears spilled down his face. But then Isabella squeezed his hand a little tighter. And that's when he saw it. The fear still lingering in her eyes. Because she wasn't just afraid for Leo anymore. She was afraid for him too. "Dad, you had a heart attack." Thomas swallowed hard, his frail body trembling. "A heart attack?" he rasped. Isabella nodded, wiping away tears. "The stress, it was too much for you," she whispered. "And you might not recover fully either." The weight of her words pressed on his chest like bricks. But there was no fear in his heart anymore. Because in that moment, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. If he had died in that hospital hallway, he would have left with no regrets. Because for the first time in his entire life, he had fought for something real. For his family. For love. For a second chance he had once thrown away. And now? Now, all that mattered was making it long enough to see Leo run again. Thomas lifted a shaking hand and touched Isabella's cheek. "My time might be short," he whispered, "but whatever time I have left, it belongs to you and Leo." Isabella let out a soft sob, gripping his hand tightly. "We still need you, Dad," she whispered. Thomas smiled weakly. "I'm not going anywhere," he promised. And for once, he meant it. Thomas had survived the heart attack. But he was not the same man who had walked into the hospital that night. Something inside him had changed. He had spent a lifetime chasing power, thinking that success was measured in wealth, in business deals, in the size of the empire he built. But lying in that hospital bed, watching Isabella hold Leo's tiny hand as the boy recovered, Thomas finally understood the truth. Success was not in power. It was in the hands that held yours when you were at your weakest. It was in the people who stayed when everything else fell apart. And he had almost lost them. But life had given him one last chance. And this time, he would not waste it. After weeks of recovery, Thomas was finally discharged from the hospital. His body was weak, but his heart had never been stronger. As he walked through Isabella's front door, this time, with no business deals to distract him, no boardroom waiting, he felt something he had never felt before. He felt at home. "Welcome back, Grandpa," Leo beamed, running up to him with open arms. Thomas knelt down carefully, ignoring the ache in his old bones, and hugged his grandson tight. And in that moment, he realized something. For years, he had searched for purpose, for meaning, for something that made all his wealth feel worth it. And now, it was right here. A few days later, as Thomas sat with Isabella on the couch, he did something he had never done before. He opened up. "I was a fool," he admitted, staring at his wrinkled hands. "I thought that leaving you was the right thing. That if I walked away, I could escape my mistakes." Isabella watched him carefully, her face soft but unreadable. "But life doesn't work that way," Thomas continued, his voice shaking. "You can't run from your past. You can't run from the people who love you. And you can't buy back lost time." He turned to Isabella, his eyes full of regret, full of love. "I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. I don't expect you to forget what I did. But if there's still a place for me in your life, I'd like to stay." For a long moment, Isabella said nothing. And then, she took his hand. "You don't have to ask, Dad," she whispered. "You're already here." And that was enough. But Thomas knew that words alone weren't enough. If he truly wanted to make things right, he had to do something that proved he had changed. So one morning, he called Isabella and Leo into the living room. "I have something for you," he said, pulling out a small envelope. Isabella frowned, confused, as she opened it, and when she saw what was inside, her eyes widened in shock. "Dad, what is this?" she whispered. Leo peeked over her shoulder, his eyes big with curiosity. It was a deed to a house. Thomas smiled softly. "It's yours." Isabella's breath hitched. "I don't understand," she said, shaking her head. "You don't have to." "I know," Thomas cut in, "but I want to." He exhaled slowly, looking around the small apartment that had become his safe haven over the past months. "This place, it's been home," he said, "but you and Leo deserve something more. A place of your own. A place where you can build a future." Isabella's hands trembled as she looked down at the papers again. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a cold, empty estate like the one Thomas had once called home. It was a house filled with warmth, with light, with love, a house where memories could be made, not bought. Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "Just say yes," Thomas said, smiling. And so, she did. The new house was everything Isabella had ever dreamed of. A small backyard where Leo could play. A cozy fireplace where they could sit on cold nights. A kitchen where they could cook together, as a family. And at the center of it all, Thomas. Not the cold businessman he had once been. Not the absent father who had left. But a grandfather who loved his grandson more than anything in the world. He was there for every school recital. He was there for every bedtime story. He was there for every scraped knee, every soccer game, every late-night talk. And as the days turned into months, and the months into years, Leo grew up knowing something Thomas never had as a child. He knew what it was like to have a grandfather who never gave up on him. One day, as Thomas and Leo sat together on the porch, the boy turned to him with curious eyes. "Grandpa," he asked, "if you could go back and change anything, would you?" Thomas thought for a long moment, staring at the sunset. "I used to think I'd change everything," he admitted. "I thought I'd go back and make different choices." Leo tilted his head. "And now?" Thomas smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "And now, I realize, if I changed the past, I might not have ended up here, with you." Leo grinned. And Thomas knew, in that moment, that he had finally found the peace he had spent his whole life searching for. Thomas's story is a reminder to us all. Wealth and power fade, but love? Love is what remains. So don't waste years chasing the wrong things. Don't wait until it's too late to make things right. If you have someone you love, someone you need to forgive, someone you need to reach out to, do it today. Because in the end, family is the only thing that truly matters. What do you think of Thomas's journey? Let us know in the comments. Like this story if you believe in second chances. Subscribe for more inspiring, emotional stories.